Thank you. Now, I have the task of talking to you about the genesis of the Triple Entente. And, of course, the Triple Entente today is widely forgotten, widely misunderstood. I guess many people think that this is a term from a French sex manual. But it is drawn rather from actually diplomatic history. The Triple Entente is the name given to the alliance among Great Britain, France, and Russia, which was formed during the first decade of this century and which led to the outbreak of the First World War. This Triple Entente was the personal creation of King Edward VII of Great Britain. This Triple Entente was indeed King Edward's own idea. It was King Edward who set up the British alliance with Japan, the Russo-Japanese War, and the 1905 Russian Revolution. It was King Edward VII, acting as the autocrat of British foreign policy, who engineered the Entente Cordiale with France in 1903, and who then went on to seal the fateful British-Russian Entente of 1907. It was King Edward who cleverly massaged Theodore Roosevelt and other American leaders to help bring about the US-UK special relationship, the bane of our own national life, which dates from this time. This diplomatic work was masterminded and carried out by Edward VII personally, with the various British ministers, cabinets, round tables, and other apparatus merely following in his wake. Edward had a geopolitical vision in the Venetian tradition, and this was one of brutal simplicity. The encirclement of Germany by a hostile coalition, followed by a war of annihilation in which many of Britain's erstwhile allies, especially France and Russia, would also be decimated and crippled. Now, Edward VII died in May of 1910 before he could see his life's work brought to completion. But he had created, in his lifetime, the war alliance of Britain, France, Russia, Japan, with support from the United States, that would take the field in August of 1914. He had created the nightmare of crossed mobilizations among Germany, France, and Russia. And he had created a network of co-thinkers who would, when the time came, send out the mobilization telegrams and launch the war. The great madmen of 1914, Sir Edward Grey, Izvolsky, Sazonov, Delcasse, Clemenceau, Poincaré, were all agents of Edward VII's influence. It was, in short, Edward's crowd that made sure that the lights went out across Europe, never to be re-illuminated for a generation or more. Now, Edward VII was also a Casanova with a crown. He was a satyr and sodomist on the throne of England. He was the royal rake of Edwardian legend. He was, most of all, more than any other single human being, the author of the First World War, and thus brought about what is probably the most destructive single event in the history of Western civilization. Without Edward's exertions, this war could not have occurred. The Lord of the Isles, as we see him in his Scottish costume at the Waverley Ball of 1871, was the Lord of the Flies. Now, why should we be concerned with these matters today? The main things that have gone wrong in the 20th century are demonstrably rooted in World War I. World War I opened the door for the communism of Lenin and Stalin, the fascism of Mussolini and Hitler. World War I made possible the entire Versailles system, including reparations, which produced the Great Depression. And finally, World War II, with its greater scale of destruction, was essentially the prolongation of the First World War after 2 decades of fitful truce. In our own time, the Mad Hatters and March Hares of the London oligarchy, the Rees-Moggs and the Hitler herds, are proposing a return to the Triple Entente as the shape of things to come. Edward VII has been hailed by the British as the greatest political activist of the House of Windsor, or the greatest monarch since William the Conqueror in 1066. He represents the interesting case in which the monarch and the leader of the oligarchy are united in the same person. The result was an autocrat more absolute than the Kaiser or the Tsar. Now, born in 1841, Edward VII had the typical Saxe-Coburg-Gotha mug, a little bit like the current heir apparent. Edward VII was a pupil of Lord Palmerston, with whom he discussed a Russian alliance during the mid-1860s. The young Edward VII was also close to Palmerston's stooge, Napoleon III, and the Empress Eugenie. At the time of the 7 Weeks' War between Prussia and Austria in 1866, Edward's mother, Queen Victoria, sympathized with Prussia, but Edward supported Austria. In 1866, Edward favored what he called an Anglo-French entente to contain Prussia. This was already the germ of a London-Paris entente cordiale of nearly 40 years later. Hostility to Prussia and later to Germany is thus the one fixed point of Edward VII's career. What is reflected here is classic Venetian geopolitics as applied by the British. For centuries, London's maxim has been to ally with the second strongest continental power in order to destroy the strongest continental power. Until 1870, the British perceived Russia as the strongest land power. But in the 1870s, that changed abruptly with the emergence of United Germany. Edward VII was quicker than other elements of the British oligarchy to take note of that momentous shift. Edward visited Canada and the United States in the fall of 1860, helping to give a final push to secession and civil war. In 1862, he was in Egypt and the Middle East. In 1875 and 1876, Edward visited India, where he helped to launch the Afghan War, the Second Afghan War of 1878, which was waged against the influence of Russia. One of the members of Edward's party on that tour was his fellow rake, lifelong friend and political ally, Lord Carrington. Edward's apprenticeship for the monarchy was a long one. His father, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, died in 1861. Edward's mother, Queen Victoria, went into deep mourning and did not emerge during the 40 remaining years of her life. Now, the Queen was a raving occultist, as befits a royal house which had always been dominated by Venetians. Queen Victoria retreated into her castle at Balmoral in the Scottish Highlands, 500 miles north of London. The court was organized there as a death cult, with every pretense that Albert was still alive. His laundry had to be done, his nightgown laid out every night. Hot water was brought to his room every morning. The chamber pot was cleaned. There were 2 guest books, one for the Queen, one for Albert, and so on. Victoria made repeated attempts to contact the shade of Prince Albert in the underworld, and these became the origins of the modern British Occult Bureau. As a result of these seances, the Queen became convinced that her Scottish gillie, or attendant, John Brown, was a powerful medium through whom the spirit of Albert addressed her. Gossip seeped out from Balmoral to London that John Brown was the Queen's stallion. He was granted every conjugal privilege, including adjoining bedrooms far from the ladies in waiting. A pamphlet about Victoria appeared under the title Mrs. John Brown. Victoria was very like Miss Havisham in the Dickens novel Great Expectations, the woman for whom time had stopped when she had lost her husband. Now, when we factor in the frequent orders for opium and heroin made to the local Balmoral pharmacy, we get a picture of Victoria's life in the Highlands. Prim and straight-laced it was not. Now, when Edward VII married, he chose Princess Alexandra of the Danish royal house, who had her own anti-German revanche complex because of Bismarck's war against Denmark in 1864. Victoria remained in mourning, gazing at a marble bust of Albert, which is just on the edge of that photograph. Victoria refused to appear at state occasions, so Edward had to assume these functions for 40 years. Edward set up a household in London and began his career as a royal rake. He became the undisputed leader of British high society. This is the source of the Edwardian legend of the hedonist or sex maniac whose mistresses included Lily Langtry, Daisy the Countess of Warwick, Lady Brooke, Mrs. George Keppel, and untold others. Some of the can-can dancers painted by Toulouse-Lautrec were girlfriends of the Lord of the Flies. There was even a fling with Sarah Bernhardt, the French actress. When Bernhardt was playing in Fedora in Paris, Edward told her that he had always wanted to be an actor. In the next night, the scene in which Fedora comes upon the dead body of her lover, few recognized the heir to the British throne. Edward VII had made his stage debut as a cadaver. Marlborough House was also organized as a center of the Homintern, his residence. One of Edward's friends, Lord Arthur Somerset, known to his friends as Podge, was arrested during a police raid in one of London's numerous homosexual brothels. A satire on Edward was written in the style of Tennyson's Idylls of the King. This was called Guelpho the Gay, the Coming K. Some recall the predecessor on the throne, Edward the Confessor. This king was to go down as Edward the Caresser. Prince Felix Yusupov was the heir to the biggest fortune in Russia. He was also considered the most beautiful transvestite in Europe. One evening, Yusupov, dressed as a woman, attended the theater in Paris. He noted that there was a portly, whiskered gentleman ogling him through an opera glass from one of the box seats. Within minutes, Yusupov received a MASH note signed King Edward VII. Now remember that this Yusupov is the man who assassinated Rasputin, the holy man and reputed German agent, in December 1916, which is an event that did help to detonate the Russian Revolution of a few months later. So we see the political importance of King Edward's Homintern. Edward VII's first son was Prince Albert Victor Edward. That's him, known formally as the Duke of Clarence and Avondale. Prince Eddie, like his father, had been considered mentally impaired in his youth. Prince Eddie here was arrested at least once in a homosexual brothel. He died young. His main claim to fame today is that he is the prime suspect in the Jack the Ripper murders, front and center there with the family group. This was a grisly series of crimes involving the murder of 5 prostitutes in the Whitechapel slum of London in 1888-89. At the time of these murders, rumors abounded about the involvement of a member of the royal family and of an obscure background of Freemasonic intrigue. The papers of the attending physician of the royal family indicate that he had been treating Jack the Ripper. A number of exhaustive studies have concluded that this was Prince Eddie. According to some versions, Eddie had contracted syphilis during a trip to the West Indies during his youth. This had affected his brain. According to others, Eddie was part of a homosexual clique that had killed because they simply hated women. There is no doubt that Prince Eddie answered to the best available description of Jack the Ripper. He died conveniently in January 1892. Now, his younger brother was King George V later. He assumed his place in the succession. George V became the father of the Nazi king, Edward VIII, the baby. If persistent reports are true, the great-uncle of the current queen was the homicidal maniac Jack the Ripper. And there is this ongoing controversy about what to call the British royal house. Can you call it Hanover or Windsor or Guelph or Saxe-Coburg-Gotha? Perhaps the simplest alternative is to call it the House of Jack the Ripper. Or the house that Jack built. Now, of the existence of a cover-up in all this, there can be no doubt. One of the main saboteurs of the investigation was a certain General Sir Charles Warren, the chief of the London Metropolitan Police. Warren suppressed evidence, had witnesses intimidated, and was forced to resign amidst the public outcry about Masonic conspiracy. Warren was the master of a new Freemasonic lodge that had recently been created in London. This was the Quatuor Coronati Lodge of Research, number 2076 of the Scottish Rite. The Quatuor Coronati Lodge had been founded in 1884 with a warrant from the Grand Master of British Freemasonry, who happened to be Edward VII. Now, during these years, Edward built up an unparalleled personal network of politicians and others who owed their careers to him. They are historically significant because they constituted the International War Party up through 1914. We see some names. One of the habitués of Edward's Marlborough House set was a rising member of Parliament during the Disraeli era, Lord Randolph Churchill. Randolph was headed for a great political career when he died of syphilis. But despite the syphilis, he had a son, Sir Winston Churchill, who was promoted by Edward VII to a post in the Privy Council. Winston considered himself King Edward's protégé. Edward had urged him to pursue a career in politics and writing. For a time, Winston sent the king a daily letter summing up the activities of the House of Commons. Another servant of the Lord of the Flies was Joseph Chamberlain. Chamberlain had been mayor of Birmingham and was known for his anti-royalist rhetoric. But he too soon became, he's on the side closest to me, a member of the Marlborough House set. When Edward VII wanted to start the Boer War, he did so through Joseph Chamberlain, who was the colonial secretary in Lord Salisbury's cabinet. This Chamberlain was later the point man for Edward's deception operation of an alliance with Germany. Edward also used Chamberlain to propose the Entente Cordiale to the French. Now, those who haven't heard of Joseph Chamberlain may know his son, the later Prime Minister Sir Neville Chamberlain in the corner, the later author of the Munich sellout of 1938. A further family servant of Edward VII was Sir Edward Grey, the British Foreign Secretary who actually started World War I in July and August of 1914. Grey's father was an army officer who had joined the household of Edward when he was Prince of Wales. The elder Grey was what is called an equerry, a master of the horses. Edward was Lord Grey's godfather. Edward did the traveling, and Grey stayed in the Foreign Office to do the clerking. Grey's problem later, in August of 1914, was to make Germany think that England would not go to war until the war had actually started. And Grey did this with the help of Edward's surviving son, George V, who promised Germany neutrality by Britain in the crisis. At the same time, Grey had to convince the Russians and the French that Britain would go to war, honoring the Triple Entente and supporting Russian aggression. In his effort to start the war, Grey had to lie to his own prime minister and to his cabinet. He finally had to sell the entire result in the House of Commons. This is perfide Albion with an Edwardian pedigree. Now, Earl Grey shares with the Lord of the Flies the distinction of still being something of a household word. Both names can still be found in any supermarket in America. A leading proponent of preventive war against Germany was Edward's protege, Admiral Jackie Fisher, the man who introduced the new battleship called the Dreadnought. Now, Fisher owed his entire career, we can see Fisher owed his entire career to Edward's patronage. As first Sea Lord after 1904, Fisher was constantly talking about a need to have a sneak attack against the German Navy. He called this the need to Copenhagen the German fleet. He was referring to British attacks on the Danish fleet in Copenhagen harbor during the Napoleonic Wars. Fisher caused a war scare in November 1904 during frictions with Germany at the time of the Russo-Japanese War. This was the time when his first Copenhagening proposal leaked out. During the first Moroccan crisis of 1905, Fisher was at it again, telling Edward that the Royal Navy could, quote, have the German fleet, the Kiel Canal, and Schleswig-Holstein within a fortnight. In the Balkan crisis of 1908, Fisher again called for Copenhagen. There's nobody in Europe, not the Austrian crazies Berchtold and Hötzendorf, and not the even crazier Russian Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich, who was so outspoken a warmonger as the head of the Royal Navy. Sir Ernst Cassel typified another group that Edward cultivated assiduously, Jewish bankers. As Prince of Wales, Edward had to live on a limited allowance, and he was soon deep in debt. He accordingly allowed a series of Jewish bankers to buy their way into the presentability of the court by their benevolent management of his personal finances. with the proviso that Edward would always make a handsome profit. The first of Edward's financial advisors was Baron von Hirsch of Vienna. Then came Sir Ernest Cassel, who was knighted by Edward. Edward also cultivated the Rothschild and Sassoon families. In short, Edward's personal household finance agency was identical to the leading lights of turn-of-the-century Zionism. Cassel was also a political operative for Edward, becoming the head of the Ottoman National Bank, the Banque Ottomane, at the request of the Young Turk regime in 1909. Edward was also a close friend of Prince Louis of Battenberg, who married Princess Victoria, the daughter of Edward's late sister Alice, in 1884. This, of course, marks the entrance of the Mountbatten or Battenberg clan, including Louis, Lord Louis Mountbatten, Prince Philip, onto the British scene. Beyond this, Asquith, Balfour, Lloyd George were all more or less Edward's stooges. Edward also influenced history through his bastards. One of Edward's bastard sons, Sir Stuart Menzies, was the head of British secret intelligence who betrayed vital U.S. secrets to the Soviets. Now, Edward had an extensive French network, including royalists, oligarchs, and others. The common denominator of Edward's network was la revanche, the need for France to exact vengeance from Germany for the loss of the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine in 1871. The central figure here was a leftish radical, George Tiger Clemenceau, that you see here to the right of Woodrow Wilson at Versailles. Clemenceau's talents for overthrowing governments gave the French Third Republic some of its proverbial instability. Clemenceau was attacked from 1892 on as a British agent and a paid spy of the British embassy. Now, a former French foreign minister, Émile Florent, saw the Dreyfus affair as concocted by Edward VII and his agents in order to break French institutional resistance to the dictatorial regime of Clemenceau. Florent wrote in this interesting book, "Clemenceau is the proconsul of the English king, charged with the administration of his province of the Gauls." Théophile Delcasse was Edward's partner in the British-French Entente Cordiale of 1903-1904. Delcasse had taken office in the confrontation of the Fashoda crisis, when London and Paris had been on the verge of war. Delcasse's view was that France could survive only as a very junior partner of the British. In the Moroccan crisis of 1905, France risked war with Germany over Morocco. Edward had interfered in French internal politics by sending Delcasse a telegram telling him not to resign, and by rushing to Paris to shore up Delcasse's position. It was clear to everybody that Delcasse was Edward's minister and not the Republic's. Delcasse had simply lied to his ministerial colleagues about the actual danger of war with Germany. Delcasse fell as foreign minister but stayed on in other posts. Other members of Edward's network in France included Paul Cambon, who was for many years the French ambassador in London, and Raymond Poincaré, the wartime president and a leading warmonger. A plumpish, dandified man, he wore a pearl pin in his white waistcoat, always affected white spats, carried a lorgnette, and trailed a faint touch of violet eau de cologne. So wrote a contemporary of Alexander Petrovich Izvolsky, the Russian foreign minister who was Edward's partner for the Anglo-Russian Entente of 1907, which completed the encirclement of Germany. Edward assigned Izvolsky the Anglo-Russian Entente in 1904, and at that point, Izvolsky entered Edward's personal service. Izvolsky was made Russian foreign minister in May 1906, after Russia's defeat in the Russo-Japanese War. He served under Prime Minister Stolypin. With Izvolsky, Russian diplomacy gave up all interest in the Far East, made deals with the British for Iran, Afghanistan, and Tibet, and concentrated everything on the Balkans, the approach that was, of course, to lead straight to World War. When Izvolsky was in danger of losing his job, Edward telegraphed to the Tsar that he should stay in office. Izvolsky had to settle for Russia's Paris embassy, where he used a special fund to bribe French journalists to create war hysteria. In July 1914, Izvolsky ran around Paris screaming that it was his war that had just started. Izvolsky was succeeded as Russian foreign minister by Sazonov, another British agent, who played a key role in getting the fateful Russian mobilization of July 1914 going on. Now, the Lord of the Flies had a favorite pen pal. His favorite pen pal was U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt was handled from day to day by Cecil Spring Rice of Sir Edward Grey's Foreign Office. Starting in 1904, Edward wrote Teddy letters about how the two of them had been placed in command of the two great branches of the Anglo-Saxon race. Teddy wrote back about the need for understanding between the English-speaking peoples, and he also discussed his theories of our racial stock. Eddie wrote to Edward that his view, and this is what Theodore Roosevelt said, is that the real interests of the English-speaking peoples are one, alike in the Atlantic and the Pacific. Roosevelt served Edward's goals in the mediation of the Russo-Japanese War, in support of the British at Algeciras and the conference there, and in raising naval disarmament at the Hague Conference. But behind his back, Edward's envoys mocked the president as a gauche semi-savage who gave primitive lunches at Oyster Bay. Later, Sir Edward Grey exerted a decisive influence on Woodrow Wilson through the intermediary of his key advisor, Colonel House. Edward was called the Uncle of Europe, Uncle Bertie, because so many of Queen Victoria's other children had married into the various royal houses, making Europe, in effect, one royal family. Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany was Edward's nephew. Tsar Nicholas II was also his nephew, married to Edward's wife's niece. After 40 years as Prince of Wales, Edward knew oligarchical Europe like a book. He was personally acquainted with every crowned head, every prominent statesman and minister. He could gauge their influence, their process of thought, and their probable response in an emergency. Now, Fleuron, that we saw before, found that Edward owed his triumphs primarily to himself, to his profound knowledge of the human heart and the sagacity with which he could sort out the vices and weaknesses of individuals and peoples and make these into the worst and most destructive weapons against them. Edward's empire was built on eternal human folly and on intellectual and moral degradation of the subject populations. Fleuron praised Edward's practical understanding of French ideology. Edward knew how to exploit the chauvinism of the revanchards to incite France against Germany. He knew how to play on the fascination of the Russian Slavophiles with the greater Serbia agitation in the Balkans. He knew how to use the hatred of the Italian irredentisti against Austria to detach Italy from the pro-German Triple Alliance. He knew how to drive wedges between Germany and Austria by evoking Viennese resentment about Prussian preeminence and their fear of Serbia. He could also exploit an American racist's eagerness to be, like the king, a member of the Anglo-Saxon master race. He could even use the aspirations of Japanese militarists for the greater glory of the British Empire. Much of Edward's personal magnetism was exercised in his incessant state visits, where he was able to unleash highly orchestrated outbursts of Bertie mania. And for those who recall the Gorby mania of some years back, you understand this phenomenon. Now, Edward's mastery of psychological and ideological manipulation is most evident in his relation with his pathetic, unstable nephew, Kaiser Wilhelm. Edward had indeed made a detailed study of Willie's psychological profile, which he knew to be pervaded by feelings of inferiority and, worse yet, incurable Anglophilia. Now, the British and Entente demonization of Wilhelm as the world's chief warmonger is absurd. Wilhelm's problem was that he felt inferior to British royalty. Edward could always get the desired result from the Kaiser. If he wanted a public tantrum from the Kaiser, he could get that. One writer reports that Edward punched the Kaiser at a meeting, knocking him down. But if Edward needed to be friendly, he could do that too. During the Boer War, when Britain's diplomatic isolation was at its height, Edward was able to con the Kaiser into making a state visit to London. Not just once, but again and again and again, the Kaiser muffed opportunities to checkmate Edward's plans. Edward also played on the Kaiser to sabotage the Berlin to Baghdad railway, which you see. At Windsor Castle in 1907, Edward demanded that the British keep control of a section of the railway between Baghdad and the Persian Gulf as a gate. The gate was to block German troops going to India, supposedly. The Kaiser was ready to grant such a gate. Otherwise, Edward always said that the talks about the Baghdad railway had to be four-way, with France, Russia, Britain, Germany, so that the German proposals could always be voted down 3-1. When the war was finally over and the Kaiser had lost his throne, he arrived at his place of exile in Holland and turned to his host and said, "Now for a cup of real good English tea." Now, Edward had always joked with his French friends that while many men seemed to pray to an eternal father, he was the only one with an eternal mother. But Queen Victoria finally died in 1901, and Edward began his drive to world war. Now, Edward's geopolitical problem was rooted in Lord Salisbury's policy of British splendid isolation. On the continent of Europe, there were two main alliances: the Triple Alliance of Germany and Austria-Hungary, with Italy as an adulterous partner. Opposed to this was the dual alliance of the France of Anatole and the Russia of Count Witte. Britain was a member of neither one. Now, British relations with all the continental powers were bad. Russia had been traditionally hostile since the Crimean War of mid-century. With France, Britain had just been to the brink of war in the Fashoda affair. Resentment remained great. Relations between Britain and the United States were traditionally bad. A dangerous flare-up had come in the 1895 boundary dispute between Venezuela and British Guiana, when President Grover Cleveland, of all people, had invoked the Monroe Doctrine and forced the British to accept arbitration. Edward had cleared that one up with the help of his American asset, Joseph Pulitzer. In the midst of all this, Edward and Joseph Chamberlain had started the Boer War against the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, two small states dominated by Dutch-speaking settlers in the Cape area of Africa. Now, the British tried to force the Afrikaners to knuckle under, and this led to the celebrated Black Week of December 1899, a stunning series of British military defeats, piles of British dead on the ground. A wave of anti-British hatred swept the world as press accounts from the front showed that the bullying imperial colossus had feet of clay. German, French, and Russian newspapers fulminated against London. The Russian government asked Paris and Berlin if they may not consider a joint intervention to stop the British. Agitation grew when the British responded to their defeats with increased atrocities. The British set up what you see here, the first concentration camps of the 20th century, in which Afrikaner children were systematically starved to death on the direct order of the Lord of the Flies. As a good Venetian, Edward recognized what he was dealing with. It was a Cambrai moment. In 1509, the Venetian oligarchy, after centuries of geopolitical perfidy, had been faced with a united front of virtually every other power in Europe, all seeking to destroy Venice. Edward himself had seen something similar in 1863, when Russia and the United States seemed to be about to combine to crush the British Empire. And now, between 1899 and 1902, public opinion in every country, including the United States, demanded measures against the British Lion. Britain risked the formation of a continental league or continental coalition or some other, as they put it, hostile combination on a well-nigh overwhelming scale. Now, Gasparo Contarini and the Venetian patricians of his time had responded to the War of the League of Cambrai by launching the Protestant Reformation and the Wars of Religion. Edward responded to the isolation of the British Empire by launching World War I. The first imperative for Edward was a deception operation to dupe and neutralize Germany, the natural centerpiece of any continental coalition against England. This was the mission of Joseph Chamberlain, member of the cabinet. Chamberlain said in a speech, November 1899, "No far-seeing statesman could be content with England's permanent isolation on the continent of Europe. The natural alliance is between ourselves and the German Empire. Interest and racial sentiment unite the two peoples, and a new triple alliance of Germany, England, and the United States would correspond to the sentimental tie that already binds Teutons and Anglo-Saxons together." Now, this rhetoric of a racist alliance was aimed at the Kaiser, who was so eager to be accepted among the Anglo-Saxons. Wilhelm was advised by his chancellor, Prince von Bülow, described as slippery as an eel, and by the gray eminence of the German foreign ministry, Baron von Holstein. Now, were these men British agents or British dupes? Were they part of a homosexual court cabal? Perhaps. In any case, Britain was offering an Anglo-German deal, and Berlin was interested, but with hard bargaining. The Berlin consensus was that Britain needed Germany, and that as time went on, the price that London would have to pay for German help could only increase. The Kaiser's policy was thus to move slowly towards a deal with London. Von Bülow and Holstein were adamant that a British alliance with France or Russia was simply impossible given the existing frictions. And so Wilhelm and his advisors let slip the great opportunity for a continental bloc, which would have meshed with the efforts of Anatole and Witte. Wilhelm was chasing the chimera of an accord with London, which was nothing but a racist deception ploy. In January 1901, when he came to town for Queen Victoria's funeral, the Kaiser was still proposing an Anglo-German alliance, the British to keep the sea and Germany the land. With such an alliance, not a mouse could stir in Europe without our permission, said the Kaiser. Even after 1918, the Kaiser was still repeating that he had saved Britain from a French-German-Russian combination during the Boer War. Now, the Kaiser liked to talk about the yellow peril in the Far East. But Edward got himself an ally, and the first one he got was Japan. Cartoon of the day. Edward wanted to use Japan as his Asian torpedo against Russia. The Japanese had conflicts with Russia in China and Korea. They were looking for an ally. The critical moment came when the former Prime Minister, Marquis Ito, visited London in December 1901. Edward saw to it that Ito was socially lionized and decorated, and an Anglo-Japanese treaty was signed within a month. Both partners were in a big hurry because the Trans-Siberian Railway was nearing completion, and that would vastly increase Russian power in the Far East. The key clause was that if Japan went to war in the Far East against a single power, Britain would observe a benevolent neutrality. This meant in practice that if Japan and Russia went to war, the British would prevent any other Europeans from helping Russia. And that gave Japan a free hand for Admiral Togo's sneak attack on the Russian base of Port Arthur in early 1904, which people at the time perhaps were unable to see would lead to further complications 30 or 40 years down the line. King Edward did everything he could but go to war against Russia. When the Russians lost their fleet in the Far East, they embarked on the desperate gamble of sending their Baltic squadron all the way around the world to fight the Japanese. In October 1904, Russian ships steamed through the North Sea. They fired on some British fishing trawlers, sinking one of them. The Russian admiral said he thought they were Japanese torpedo boats. This was the Dogger Bank incident. Edward went to the brink of war, demanding that the Royal Navy stop the Russian ships, seize the Russian admiral, and punish him, although Edward did quickly back down. In order to reach the Far East, the Russian fleet required logistical assistance. Now there was nowhere to get coal. The Kaiser was in a mood to court Russia, so German ships did the coaling. The British press demanded that the Royal Navy stop the Germans from delivering the coal. And this was when Fischer began popping off again about Copenhagening the Germans. This was all a circus set up by Edward for his geopolitical aims. The Russians came out of this war with one capital ship left. But Edward wanted not just a defeat, he wanted a disaster beyond the power of Japan to inflict. To procure the disaster he wanted, Edward unleashed British intelligence with all of its assets, boyars, liberals, communists, Zionists, the works. And this produced a civil war which went on into 1906, crippling Russia as a military power. In the meantime, the Lord of the Flies had sealed his pact with France. No, I haven't. I've gone 41. Now, at first, Edward was not popular in France because of centuries of conflict and because of fashoda, for which he was personally blamed. Indeed, for a time, Edward's image in Paris was decidedly bad. Joseph Chamberlain, who had... His image was bad. Joseph Chamberlain, who had terrified the French with his pro-German line, took a message to the French. Edward was willing to trade Egypt for Morocco to get a deal with France. Now, this was a very unequal barter. Since the 1880s, the British presence in Egypt was officially temporary. The British were supposed to get out. But of course, they had no intention of getting out. They wanted the entire Nile Valley. But the French still had some rights in Egypt. But if the French caved in, the British position in Egypt would become unassailable, at least by Europeans. Morocco was a different story. The Moroccan government was stronger, and there were strong competing claims by Germany and Spain. So the idea of French preeminence in Morocco simply placed France and Germany once again on a collision course. But with the help of Delcasse, Clemenceau, and Cambon, the deal was signed. Edward contributed a tour de force of personal diplomacy, his visit to Paris in the spring of 1903. This was when Bertie turned on the charm with speeches in French about his friendship, recalling his sentimental association with Paris, Biarritz, and the Riviera. The press was undoubtedly well paid. The Parisian dandies and gratins, the elitists, turned Anglophile overnight in an explosion of Bertie mania that was crowned by Edward's appearance at Longchamp, the racetrack, with the wife of President Loubet, a puppet of Clemenceau. This celebration started France on the road that led to Verdun, with 6 million casualties, proportionately the highest of any belligerent. Now, the Lord of the Flies had designed the Moroccan Gambit in the hope that Germany would quickly take the bait and challenge the new French domination in Morocco. The Kaiser gave Edward exactly the crisis he needed. Von Bülow recommended that Germany should challenge France in Morocco to show France that the British alliance was worthless. If France was the continental dagger now in the hands of England, von Bülow argued, it was time to knock that dagger out of British hands. Von Bülow convinced the witless Kaiser to undertake the lunatic adventure of going to Tangier, Morocco in March of 1905. And this, of course, led to the brink of war between France and Germany. Now, Delcasse decided to hang tough and go to the brink. But when the other members of the government realized that war was imminent, Delcasse was fired. But this crisis succeeded in heating up the revanche syndrome in France all the more, directing all of the hatred back against Germany, although because of Russia still being crippled and at war with Japan, the French were thrown completely into the arms of Edward. And joint French-British military planning began at that point. Now, this first Moroccan crisis, in my view, was a serious attempt by Edward to start war, despite the fact that France's ally, Russia, was crippled. It is certain that Edward was urging France, through Delcasse, to go all the way. And theoretically, under the dual alliance, Russia would have been forced to join France in the war, like it or not. But the French cabinet pulled back. In the midst of all these events, Kaiser Wilhelm and Tsar Nicholas II met at Bertie, a Baltic fjord in Finland. This was a poignant moment. It was the last abortive revolt of the two doomed nephews of Edward VII.
the revolt of Willie and Nicky. Nicholas was unhappy with his French alliance because France had done nothing to help him against Japan and had rather concentrated on courting Uncle Bertie. The Kaiser had now momentarily returned to his idea of a continental league. As the two conversed, it became clear to the Kaiser that the Tsar feels a deep personal anger at England and the king. The Tsar called Edward the greatest mischief maker and the most dangerous and deceptive intriguer in the world. The Kaiser agreed, noting that he too had suffered from Edward's intrigues. Edward had a passion for plotting against every power, they agreed. The Kaiser exacted a pledge from the Tsar that never would Russia join with England against Germany. The Kaiser even proposed that the two cousins join in a little agreement of their own to stymie Edward. The Tsar accepted. He signed a draft treaty of mutual defense, which the Kaiser pulled from his pocket. They tearfully pledged their friendship, but they could not escape the Lord of the Flies. If this idea of Russian-German cooperation had been exploited, World War I could not have occurred in the form in which it finally came in 1914. But when the Kaiser told von Bülow, the Chancellor threatened to resign, and in response to that, the Kaiser said that if he were jilted, he would commit suicide. The Russian response was more complicated, but the opportunity drifted away. Within 2 years, Russia would be England's ally. Now, in April 1904, on the same day in which the Anglo-French Entente had come into effect, Edward VII had talked with his agent Izvolsky to activate the Anglo-Russian combination. With the help of Izvolsky, Edward cut a deal with Russia that divided Iran into spheres of influence, while Afghanistan and Tibet were neutralized. The Russians got nothing about their eternal goal of Constantinople but vague encouragement. Now, the Anglo-Russian Entente, which we see now, was signed in September 1907. In June 1908, Edward VII sailed to Reval for an ocean-going state visit to Tsar Nicholas II. The meeting of the uncle and the nephew was the grimmest of portents, foreshadowing Russia's 9 million casualties in World War I, more than any belligerent, with more than 3/4 of all Russian soldiers ended up killed, wounded, or missing. And that, of course, set the stage for 1917 and the Bolshevik regime. But for Edward, the important thing was that Germany had now been encircled. The ring had been closed. Bismarck's old nightmare, the cauchemar des coalitions, the nightmare of the coalitions, the two-front war, was now reality. With the help of Izvolsky, Edward, within a couple of months after this meeting, embarked on a new attempt to start a general war. This was the so-called Buchlau bargain between Izvolsky and Austria, made in September 1908 and revealed about a month later. By this deal, Austria was given the go-ahead to formally annex Bosnia-Herzegovina, which had been occupied by Austria after the Congress of Berlin, but not annexed. In exchange, Russia was supposed to get the right to send warships through the Straits, but this was blocked by the British. When Austria annexed Bosnia-Herzegovina, Serbia protested because Serbia wanted to take this territory. Austria and Serbia mobilized their armies and went to the brink of war. But Germany restrained Austria. Russia felt too weak for war. Germany actually mediated the dispute, but Edward's agent soon concocted a legend that Germany had humiliated Russia with the threat of war. Now, as a result of this Balkan crisis of 1908-1909, the Russian Slavophiles turned their rage more and more against Germany. The Greater Serbia agitators went wild. The Austrian government concluded that Serbia was a threat to its existence and had to be crushed. And this is exactly the pattern that led to war 4 years later in 1914. Now, behind the Buchlau bargain and the Balkan crisis of 1908 was King Edward. Russian war with Germany had been on his agenda with the Tsar in Reval. And in August of 1908, Edward had met with Izvolsky and Clemenceau at Marienbad, his favorite spa, just before Izvolsky made the Buchlau bargain. During that same month, Edward also met with Franz Josef, the Austrian emperor, in Bad Ischl. Edward had every reason to start this crisis. If Germany had repudiated Austria, Germany would have been left totally isolated with no allies left whatsoever. If Germany supported Austria, the result would be either immediate war or increased tensions that could turn to war soon. Now, it took one more Moroccan crisis and two more Balkan crises, and war came. It came soon, but not soon enough for Edward. The old Rouet died in May of 1910. And at that time, a newspaper in Leipzig, Germany, wrote that Edward had skillfully woven the Nessus robe to destroy the German Hercules. Now remember, in the old Greek myth, the hero Hercules could not be killed by any living man, but Hercules was killed by the centaur Nessus. Nessus had tried to rape Deianira, the wife of Hercules. Hercules killed him. The dying Nessus told Deianira to soak the robe of Hercules in his own blood and dress him in it if he should ever seem unfaithful. Deianira did this, and the poisoned centaur blood of Nessus, the sex-crazed old centaur, finally killed Hercules. For a few moments in July 1914, the Kaiser realized what had happened. Edward's coalition, he said, had taken the Austro-Serbian conflict as an excuse for waging a total war of extermination against Germany. That is the situation set into motion by Edward VII. The famous encirclement of Germany has finally become a fact, and we squirm isolated in the net. Edward VII is stronger after his death than am I, who am still alive. Now, as a pamphlet issued in Germany shortly after the beginning of the war stated, King Edward was the greatest criminal against humanity in the 20th century, and nothing that has happened in the meantime makes that case less compelling. Now, from Edward's time to our own, the British monarchy has successfully weathered three storms of a peculiar type. One was the Republican agitation of about 1870, reflecting the dissatisfaction with Victoria as a royal recluse, and with Edward, the heir apparent, as a rake. Then came 1916-1918, when British troops began to die in large numbers on the Western Front of World War I. That caused a huge wave of hatred for all things German, including the royal family, who had to take the absurd name of Windsor to cover up their German origins. This was when George V refused to accept the Tsar because he feared a political reaction. Then came the Edward VIII crisis of 1936, which reflected the fact that the king was a Nazi. And now, since 91-92, we have the Charles and Diana crisis. But there is no reason to assume that the British monarchy, having weathered all these storms, will be easily swept away. We must rather conclude that the royals will stop at nothing, including a military coup, a fascist dictatorship, or World War III, to avoid giving up power. The historical truth about Edward VII greatly simplifies the question of who and what caused World War I. The cause of World War I was King Edward VII. His geopolitics, his diplomacy, his agents, his alliance system. A clause in the Versailles Treaty specifies that Germany bears the entire guilt for World War I. This is absurd. The World War was caused by Edward VII, as we have seen. The dismantling of the Versailles system must therefore include the revision of the Versailles Treaty to specify British war guilt in the person of King Edward VII. France, Russia, Japan, Italy, the United States, and other great nations were used by Edward VII as geopolitical pawns, and they have suffered immeasurably as a result. 90 years after Edward's Entente, citizens and statesmen must learn the lesson of how the British monarchy and oligarchy orchestrated the catastrophe of 1914. We must save human civilization from the heirs to the Lord of the Flies.